Very much, James, for the introduction. All right, like James said, my name is Fortune. I'll be the one taking you for Economics 10B. All right, so I would want to introduce the subject. Allow me to screen. I want to screen a document so that I'll be having a reference of what I'm saying. All right. I hope my screen is visible. All right, so Economics 10B is basically macroeconomics. We'll be looking at economics at a broader economic level and in the spectrum of what will be happening at the broader economic perspective. So macroeconomics is different from microeconomics. Microeconomics will be looking at the economy at market and industrial level and down to the individual level. But when you're looking at macroeconomics, we're now looking at the whole economy. Can somebody please mute themselves? Someone who's disturbing my, all right, thank you very much. All right, so Economics 10B is a very broad module, which we're going to be looking at a very broad range of topics. On the left side of your screen, if you can see, there is a document that is there that is projecting the contents that is required for us to cover in terms of Economics 10B. All right, so the first unit requires us to cover the measuring of the performance of the economy, whereby we'll be looking at various measures in terms of the performance of an economy. And we're going to be looking at that one in detail. Then the second unit requires us to look at the monetary sector, whereby we're now looking at the monetary side of the economy, and especially focusing on the economy of South Africa, and looking from the definitions of money, at how money is made, the South African Reserve Bank, and the monetary policy that is initiated in terms of how money is going to be handled in South Africa. Then the third unit talks about the public sector, the foreign sector on the fourth unit, and the fifth unit talks about the Keynesian model of the economy, and the sixth also talks about the Keynesian models, including the government and the foreign sector. Then the seventh topic will be looking at the macroeconomic theory and policies that affect the economy. Then on unit 9, we'll be looking at the topic of unemployment, various measures of unemployment, and how unemployment has its relations with inflation. Then the last topic that we'll be looking at is the economic growth and business cycles. All right, so as you can see that this module is a very broad module and has a lot of things that needs to be covered in the short space of your semester. So it requires us to be people that are very timely when it comes to covering some of the topics and ensuring that we understand them timelessly. All right, so without wasting much of your time, there's a topic that I'm going to be introducing today, just as an introductory topic, not necessarily following any chronology of the study module, but so that we might have a snippet of an understanding of what we'll be dealing with in terms of this module. All right, so I want to stop the share and just screen the document that I'll be using for today's presentation. All right. Okay, I hope the document is visible. Let me try to zoom out a little bit, zoom in. All right. So today I want us to look at inflation. I just picked the topic randomly, just for us to have a familiarization of the module. All right. So if you look at an economy is affected by a broad range of activities, and these activities are measured in different ways. The first topic talks about the measuring of the performance of an economy, whereby we use various metrics in measuring the performance of an economy. So there are basically 5 metrics that are used in measuring the performance of an economy, which ranges from what is referred to as economic growth, and we have what is referred to as price stability. We have what is referred to as the balance of payments. We have also what is referred to as the distribution of income and wealth. And we also have the unemployment or the full employment spectrum, whereby we'll be assessing the level of utilization of resources within an economy. So when it comes to measuring what is referred to as price stability within an economy, we use a metric that is referred to as inflation. All right, I'm sure you've heard about this term inflation more often than not, especially when it comes to if you're watching maybe business news or anything that has to do with the South African economy. This term inflation is mentioned more often than not. So it is a very important phenomenon when it comes to assessing the performance of an economy, because it gives us an overview of how the cost of living within that economy is at. All right. So by definition, inflation is defined as a sustained increase in the general price level. All right. So the definition has to be taken holistically. By sustained increase, we're not just looking at a minor increase, maybe in the price of maybe one good within the economy, but it has to be the general price level. And the general price level, when you look at the general price level, it is measured by a metric which is referred to as the consumer price index. All right, I hope I'm not rushing when it comes to my explanation. I want you to understand it because it is a very, very important topic. All right, so with the consumer price index, when it comes to measuring inflation, the consumer price index reflects the cost of a representative of a basket of goods and services within a nation. If it is in South Africa, there is a selection of goods and services that are selected and weighted when it comes to measuring inflation. And usually these are defined as basic commodities or the basic services that are required for people to be able to survive on their day-to-day basis easily. All right. So this basket, this consumer basket of goods and services is given various weights. We're not really going to be looking at in much detail at how this basket is brought about, what they take into account when selecting the goods and services that are going to be included within this consumer basket. But we just want to look at how it is going to help us in calculating what is referred to as the inflation rate. All right, so when the consumer price index is calculated, they take the cost of the representative baskets of goods and services, which might be either, they might take maybe one insurance, and they might take maybe the basic prices maybe of bread, of meat, and maybe some of the basic services, maybe like rentals and all these other things. And they give certain weights to these goods and services, and they ascribe those weights in relation to the importance of the service or the importance of the goods. Then an index is brought about. We're not going to be looking at that. I want us to look at how we're going to be using the index in coming up with the inflation rate. All right, so suppose we are given an index that has already been calculated for a particular year or for a particular period of time. There's a formula that we're going to be using in coming up with the inflation rate. So the basic formula is calculated as the consumer price index of the current years, which I've reflected on the screen there as CPI2, and minus the consumer price index of the previous year or the best year, In other words, the year that is has been selected to be having stable prices within the economy over a period of time. So there's a selection that is made for the best year, whereby they look at successive years and they determine in which of these years was the prices within an economy deemed to be more stable. And they select that to be the best year. So the current year's price minus the best year price over the best year's price, or the best year consumer index, times 100 would give you what is referred to as the inflation rate within the economy. All right, so there's an example that I'm going to be utilizing just in passing, so that we have an understanding of what we are referring to. So suppose that 2020 was our base year in relation maybe to the start of the new decade. And 2021, we're in 2021 now. Suppose that we are taking the consumer price index up to the point in time where we are in maybe up to July. And we calculate the consumer price index for July, and we get that it is 125. We're going to be calculating the consumer price index later on as a part of the module, but today we just want to look at inflation on its own. All right, so suppose that the consumer price index for 2021 is given as 125, and we have a best year of 2020, which has, obviously, if it is a best year, it is the one that is deemed to be having the stable prices. So we'll be having the best year to be having a consumer price index of 100. So the simple formula, applying the simple formula, obviously you would say 125 minus 100. Let me try to calculate this. 125 minus 100 over the base year. Okay. Times 100. So we're trying to get a percentage. Remember, inflation is calculated as a percentage. It is not calculated as a decimal, because we use percentages when it comes to expressing inflation. All right, so in this case, if you say 125 minus 100 over 100 times 100, I think you get 25%. So that means that the inflation rate between in 2021 was 25%. And what does this mean if we say that we have an inflation rate of 25% within the economy in 2021? So basically what we're saying is that the general price level within the economy in 2021, it increased by 25%. And what does this entail when it comes to the interpretation of the 25%? It means that the cost of living in South Africa has increased by 25% as compared to 2020. All right, so we're going to be looking at the various effects of inflation later on, but right now we want to look at the different types of inflation that are found within the economy, because this 25% percentage figure is just a general figure of how the price level is increased, but we do not have the manner in which the prices have increased, or we do not have an understanding of how the price has increased within the economy. So for the purposes of this module, we're going to be looking at basically two types of inflation. The first one is referred to as demand pull inflation, and the second one is referred to as cost push inflation. All right, so I'm going to start talking about demand pull inflation. All right, with demand pull inflation, it is defined as that type of inflation that occurs as a result of a sustained increase in the demand of goods and services within an economy, while there is no increase in the aggregate supply within that economy. All right, so this type of inflation occurs when there is a surge in the demand side of the economy, or an increase in the demand side of the economy as compared to the supply side of an economy. All right, so if you did your microeconomics, I'm sure you understand the concept of demand and supply. If you did not do it, or if you're still doing it, you understand the concept of demand and supply later on. and how it is used in coming up with the price level within either a market or whatever it might be. All right, so whenever we have an increase in demand and there's no increase in supply, it results on the pressure on the available goods and services within that spectrum or within that economy or within that market. And as a result, it would lead to an increase in the prices because that demand would pull up the prices upwards because there will be too much demand for the goods that are there within the economy. All right, so looking at this on a monetary perspective or from a monetary spectrum, I basically mean the monetary side of the economy. That is the amount of money that is available within the economy. We're going to be looking at the money supply and how the money supply affects the economy later on. When we'll be looking at money and how it is influenced by the monetary policy. All right, so when we have sustained high rates of monetary growth, this leads to high inflation because if you have a lot of money supply within the economy, it means that that money supply is going to crowd out the few available goods and services within that economy because the demand for goods and services would be much greater in relation to the available goods and services within that economy. And whenever we have low monetary growth within the economy, it means that we're going to be having low inflation rate, or rather, we're not going to be experiencing demand pull inflation. So in trying to summarize demand pull inflation, it can be said to be too much money chasing too few goods. So at times, they might give you the scenario of having too much money chasing too few goods, and they would want you to identify which type of inflation it is. So whenever you realize that there's too much money chasing too few goods, it means that it is demand pull inflation that is being talked about. All right, so below there is a graph that is there in which we are going to be illustrating the effect of demand pull inflation on an economy. All right, so in economics, we use graphs to express economic phenomenon or to express whatever we want to be expressing in terms of our explanations. All right, so if you look at the graph that is there, on the y-axis or on the vertical axis, we have the general price level, and on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have the total production within the economy or the total income that is there within that economy. All right, so we have two graphs there, basically two types of graphs. One is the aggregate supply that is there within the economy. The aggregate supply simply expresses the total supply of goods and services within that economy, or the total production that is occurring within that economy of goods and services. And the aggregate demand represents the total demand of goods and services within that economy. All right, so for the purposes of explaining demand pull inflation, we are saying that we are having too much money chasing too few goods. It means that we're going to be having a shift in the aggregate demand graph from, we have AD1, AD2, AD3, up to AD4. All right, so whenever we have aggregate demand shifting from one level to another, it means that there's an increase in the aggregate demand that is being influenced by exogenous factors, which are factors other than the price level itself. So we'll be looking at factors like, in this case, the increase in the money supply, or maybe the increase in people's incomes, or the increase maybe in various demands for particular goods and services within that economy. All right, so whenever we have an increase within an economy in terms of the aggregate demand, we will have a shift in the aggregate demand level, which results in the shift from, if you see there, E1 to E2, whereby we're having an equilibrium from E1 to E2. So the shift in the equilibrium would result in the general price levels increasing up to a certain extent. But you can see that in the short run there, the increase in the general price level, or rather in the aggregate demand, would also be followed by an increase in the total production within that economy. But when we get to YT there, or YF rather, which is the full employment level of the economy, the full employment level, which represents the level at which we are utilizing all the resources within the economy and we are not able to exceed that level of production by any means. So whenever we reach the full employment level of production within the economy, any further increases in the aggregate demand would result in the increases in the price without a corresponding increase in the total production or the total income within the economy. Hence, you see from AD3 to AD4 there is only an increase in the general price level from P3 to P4 without a corresponding increase in the total production or the total income within that economy, because we're operating at a full employment level of income within that economy, because there's no incentive for producers to be able to produce more within that economy because they're fully utilizing the available resources within that economy. So whenever such an inflation occurs, such an inflation is the one that we are referring to as the demand pull inflation, because it's resulting in a pressure on the available goods and services without a corresponding increase in the production. All right, so that explains demand pull inflation. We can move on to the second type of inflation, which is cost push inflation. So with demand pull inflation, it is different from cost push inflation. Cost push inflation, it is triggered by increases in the cost of production. So we'll be having an increase in the cost of production, not necessarily a change in the aggregate demand. So you have to appreciate the difference between the two. All right, so the increases in the cost of production has an effect on the aggregate supply of the economy, not the aggregate demand. So when you have an increase in the cost of production, it means it's going to be affecting the aggregate supply or the total supply within that economy in one way or the other. So below there, there's a graph that expresses that phenomenon of an increase in the cost of production. All right, so the moment when we have an increase in the cost of production, it results in the aggregate supply to shift rather leftwards. I know it's pointing upwards, so you might get confused whether is it leftwards or is it upwards, but it's leftwards because its resultant effect on the equilibrium price would be felt on E2, which is leftwards of E1. So the increase in the cost of production would result in a reduction in the supply of the economy. Why are we saying that it results in the increase in the production of the economy? Because whenever cost of either raw materials increase or the cost of labor that is being employed within the economy increase, it results in the costs of production increasing. And in such a scenario, would be having suppliers opting to cut back production, or rather to cut back their consumption either of certain labor or of certain raw materials in order for them to produce what would be optimum with the current cost of the production. So in such a scenario, it would result in them passing the increase in the cost of production in form of increases in the prices, because obviously due to the increases in the cost of production, would be having a different equilibrium within that economy. Remember, the aggregate demand is not changing here. What is changing is only the aggregate supply. So the equilibrium here would change from E1 to E2, or rather, explaining it in a different light, what would result in the increase in the cost of production or in the general price levels to increase is the change in the aggregate supply, which would result in the new equilibrium level shifting from E1 to E2, as you can see here. As indicated here, P1 to P2 would be indicating the increase in the price levels, and the total production and total income would shift from Y1 to Y2 as indicated on the graph there. So the increase in the cost of production there would result in the increase in the general price levels. So there are various causes that might lead to a cost push inflation. Some of them I've mentioned, like the increase in the labor costs. Maybe there are various labor unions that are pushing for the increases in the increases in the wages, salaries and wages that is to be received by certain particular labor force, which results in the increase in the cost of production. And you might also have an increase in the price of raw materials. And the increase in the price of raw materials might be brought about by several or a plethora of factors, which might include maybe natural disasters that might occur. For example, if a flood occurs or drought occurs in some particular instances, obviously it's going to be affecting the agricultural produce and obviously the supply of the agricultural produce. And at the end of the day, we'll be having an increase in the cost of production in terms of the supply of raw materials, which are agriculturally based. All right, so I think that explains cost push inflation and that explains demand pull inflation. So we want to look at the effects of inflation. What is it that is going to result when we have inflation within the economy? How is inflation going to be affecting the economy as a whole? All right, so we can group these effects into basically three. The first one is what we refer to as distribution effects. The second one is what we refer to as economic effects. And the last one is the social and political effects. So we're going to be explaining a little bit on the distribution effects of inflation. All right, so when inflation occurs within the economy, we're having an increase in the price levels within the economy. You'd result that you'd see that it results in the increase in prices, which affects creditors more at the expense of, or rather, it affects creditors and it benefits the debtors within the economy. What we are saying here is that if you are going to be finding yourself in a lending position or in a position where you're going to be supplying either cash or advancing your liquidity to one group or the other, whenever prices increase or prices increases, you're going to realize that the money that you're going to be receiving, by the time that you're going to be receiving it, it will be worth less the value of the money that you had given out because of inflation. Inflation erodes the value of money and it erodes the interest rates that you would have maybe charged in lending out the goods and services to the various borrowers that you are supplying the goods and services to. So this particular phenomenon, it affects also the financial sector in that it would result in negative interest rates in the financial sector, whereby you'd realize that most banks and most financial institutions would be making zero profit, or in some instances, they would actually be making losses in their businesses because of inflation. And this is the scenario that we see if you look at various economies like Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, where we had various inflations taking place there. You'd realize that what would collapse first within those economies is the financial sector of that economy, because obviously the creditors are going to be affected by the price increases that would be going on within the economy. And at the end of the day, their profits get eroded, and in some instances, the capital itself gets eroded, and people would end up losing most of their monies. And if you are to look at it again, you'd see that inflation tends to redistribute income from the wealth from the elderly to the young. Why do we say that inflation tends to redistribute wealth from the elderly to the young? Because inflation would benefit those that are quick in terms of administering transactions and all these other things. And at the end of the day, it would realize that the elderly are going to be losing out because from the fact that they are slow in terms of the way in which they're going to be administering particular transactions, it would result in them losing out. And if you also look at it again from another spectrum, the elderly have a lot of investments in retirement packages, like some put their money in mutual funds, some put their money in insurance and all these other things. And whenever inflation occurs, it would affect all those things: the insurance, the mutual funds, the retirement packages that they would have invested in. And at the end of the day, what they would have invested in during the course of their working life would be eroded in some instances back to zero. These scenarios occurred in Zimbabwe, they occurred in Germany, they occurred in Argentina, where there was hyperinflation that occurred there. Then we have redistribution of resources from the private sector to the government. All right, so the redistribution of resources from the private sector to the government occurs in a way in which that the government itself is the one that collects revenues from the private sector. And these revenues that they collect from the private sector would result in the redistribution of wealth from the private sector to the government. And these revenues, remember, mind you that they are not going to be taking a look at the inflation, the taxation that they use will obviously be the same. And at the end of the day, the profits of the private sector will be eroded at the expense of benefiting the government. And the second aspect that we have is economic effects. Within the economic effects, obviously, we're looking at various effects on the economy and how it affects various sectors of the economy within the economy. All right, so I'll start by explaining the savings aspect. So within an economy, a proper functioning economy, should encourage savings. Let me try to mute someone here. Okay. A proper functioning economy would, or rather should, encourage savings within that economy. By savings, obviously, people should have some of their income invested maybe in deposits within the financial institutions or in various insurance packages within that economy that they might withdraw at a later stage. So when inflation occurs, it would result in a discouragement of savings, in that people would be fearing to lose their hard-earned cash at the cost of inflation, because obviously the amount of money that you'd invest in would not be the same amount of money that you get whenever there is inflation. So it reduces the value of savings. Inflation also discourages savings in traditional forms of fixed deposits, pension funds, contributions, etc., and any of the savings packages that are found within the economy. And savings are an important function of the economy. We're going to be looking at savings when you're going to be looking at the macroeconomic perspective of the economy, when we'll be doing the economic models and all these other things. And you see how savings affect, or savings contribute to an economy. So whenever there's a discouragement in savings, it means that a part of the economy is going to be affected. In this regard, obviously, it's going to be the financial sector that is going to be impacted heavily by the discouragement of savings, because nobody will be interested in saving their money in the bank or having their money within the financial system, because they do not trust that they're going to be getting the same value at the end of the day. And such a scenario occurred in Zimbabwe, whereby there was what is referred to as a bank run, whereby depositors rush to withdraw their deposits from financial institutions. And whenever there is such a demand on the financial institutions and an increase in the demand for withdrawals at the same time within a particular period of time, it results in a bank failure, because most banks would not be able to execute their mandates effectively. Remember, these banks, they borrow money and they lend out money. And whenever they borrow money in form of these deposits that would have been maintained with them, and they lend out this money, which is expected to be received at some point in time in the future. And whenever there's a demand on the banking system, it results in the collapse of the banking system, because there will be a mismatch between the assets of the bank and the liabilities of the bank. And in such a scenario, obviously, the financial sector would be affected. And also, we would be having speculative practices. People would try to outwit each other by speculating in shares, foreign currency, prices of metals, instead of engaging in productive investments and investments in factories and in plants and in infrastructure that would result in the economy advancing. So such speculative practices would result in a snowball effect, which obviously would be further exacerbating on the likelihood of another inflation occurring, because obviously the moment when people try to speculate that maybe the price of this good is going to be increasing, the price of this good is going to be reducing, it results in a plethora of problems which would affect the overall economy as a whole. Then inflation also affects the balance of payments. So we're going to be talking about the balance of payments when we'll be talking about measures of the performance of an economy. The balance of payments would result in whenever we have increases in the price of goods, inflation increases the cost of exports, industries, and import competing industries. And if the inflation rate in South Africa is higher than that of our major trading partners and international competitors, then the international competitiveness of that same economy, that is the South African economy, would be affected in such a way that would be having rather more imports as compared to exports, because the price of the goods within the nation would be more expensive as compared to other economies. So basically, inflation affects all these aspects. Then lastly, but not least, it also affects the socio-political sphere within that economy. So whenever there is a price increases, or whenever the cost of living increases, it's going to be affecting the economy in one way or the other. Obviously, when people are not happy with what they are receiving in terms of salaries and wages, and whenever there is no matching of salaries and wages with the price increases, obviously it's going to be having an adverse effect on the society as a whole, because we're going to be experiencing poverty, high levels of income distribution inequality. And we're also going to be having various political effects spilling over, whereby protests and all these other things like looting will be occurring. It's as a result of price increases and inflation occurring within that economy, which would result in people not effectively being happy with what is happening within that economy. So basically, this is what we can talk about when it comes to inflation. I don't know if you have any questions or any contributions, whatever you want to say regarding the topic of inflation, which I just chose as an introduction to macroeconomic 10B. And if there are no questions, I think I can hand it over back to James. Thank you very much for attending this session. All right, so that means there are no questions. Let me see. All right. If you have any question, you can type it on the chat, or you can unmute yourself and say something. All right, so I can assume that there are no questions. All right, so in that regard, thank you very much for attending this session. And as a final remark, I can say that inflation is a very, very important topic, which examiners love too much. I haven't seen yet an exam question in which there is no aspect of inflation in which they ask it in one way or the other. So I hope this is going to be contributing immensely to your knowledge, to your body of knowledge, and preparing you for the exam. All right, thank you very much. I can hand it over to James. James, if you're hearing me, I think I can hand it back to you now.
I hope you guys had a wonderful time with the lecturer. He will be available starting from next week. As I highlighted, it's for 750 Rand if you're interested. He will take you through all the different calculations that you need to learn, all the theories, all the graphs for economics 10B. So this lecture, I've recorded it. So I will send you guys a link in the group, and I'll also post some details concerning our bank account and etc. That is if you're interested in our proceeding. Then in addition to the actual tutoring that we do, if you do need some one-on-one assistance with a specific assignment or exam, just give me a call. I will be more than willing to see if I can make an arrangement for you. Thank you guys for coming in. If there are any questions, you're open to ask them right now, but I think we've come to the end of our lecture. Any questions before we close?
Information that you got from the statistical analysis, and if you are not able, right, to interpret.
Any questions before we close? Okay, nothing. Thank you guys for coming in. I hope to see you again next week.